Most fans assumed the galaxy's greatest medicinal substance could eventually restore the man inside the black shell, but the truth is that Darth Vader's condition went so far beyond normal injury that the compound became nothing more than a maintenance tool for a body that should have died on the operating table. This story is a revealing one because it shows that the same substance capable of regrowing severed tissue and pulling soldiers back from the edge of death cannot save the one person who seems to need it most, and that the man trapped inside the armor may not even want it to. Drawing from 10 sources across both Canon and Legends, we found 4 distinct reasons the healing compound cannot restore the Dark Lord, and one grim reason he keeps stepping into the tank anyway. Before we can understand why the substance fails the Sith Lord, we first need to see how well it works for everyone else. In The Essential Guide to Warfare, the compound is defined as a revolutionary medical substance made from bacterial particles of Alazi and Kavam, spun into a Vradix lotion and mixed with a liquid called Ambori. When a patient is suspended in a tank filled with this mixture, the particles coat wounds and trigger rapid tissue regrowth, mending injuries that would otherwise be fatal. Luke Skywalker used this treatment to recover from a near-fatal Wampa attack. In the storyline Labyrinth of Evil, a Twi'lek pilot named Fa'alele lost one of her head tails to a blaster bolt, and Obi-Wan Kenobi assured her that a week in the tank would make her good as new. Anakin added that she would be back on her feet in 2 days. Catalyst, a Rogue One novel, shows Captain Ha's obit buried under metric tons of rock during an Imperial strike, then emerging from a prisoner's medbay tank after 1 week, described as nearly as good as new. For a normal biological being, this substance is nothing short of a miracle. For many injuries, days in a tank can close wounds that might otherwise be fatal, driving rapid tissue regrowth in nearly every case the sources describe. But even this compound has hard limits, and those limits begin where living tissue ends. And that is precisely where the Armored Enforcer's case falls apart. The Legends novelization of Revenge of the Sith describes it plainly. The man inside the armor does not merely have scarred lungs, he has no lungs anymore. Mechanisms hardwired into his chest must pump oxygen into his bloodstream forever. His biological legs and left arm did not just suffer burns, they rolled into the lava and burned to ash. His lips, tongue, and throat were burned away, and a vocabulator now speaks for him. His existence is described as a permanent state of burning, where part of him will always lie upon black glass sand beside a lake of fire. That level of internal detail comes from the Legends continuity, but it illustrates the broader point confirmed across both timelines. His survival depends on permanent life support infrastructure, not a temporary medicinal bath. The book Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader adds the full scope of the sensory damage. His eardrums melted in Mustafar's heat, requiring implants that transmit sound as if coming from underwater. His eyes suffered damaged corneas and retinas, so his mask uses optical hemispheres that distort his vision and prevent him from seeing his own feet without tilting his head 90 degrees. His body is covered in synth skin that constantly snags on the inferior alloy of his prosthetic limbs. His boots are so heavy that he feels rooted to the ground. The pectoral plating weighs him down so much that he can scarcely lift his arms over his head. The implants in his ears often needle him with feedback or attach echo and vibrato effects to even the faintest noise, making silence impossible. The compound can accelerate natural tissue regrowth, but in Vader's case, the critical losses are not injured tissue waiting to be mended. They're missing or permanently destroyed biological systems, organs, limbs, and sensory structures that no medicinal substance was ever designed to replace. There are no lungs to repair, no limbs to mend, no eardrums to restore. What is left behind the shell is withered, agonized flesh, and the desperate, hungry breathing of a creature that should not have been alive. And what remains of that flesh is no longer purely biological. The same novelization describes the apprentice not as a man using a tool, but as a pieced-together hybrid of droid and human, encased in a life support casing of gleaming black, managed by a thoracic processor. Sensors trickle meaning directly into his brain. Optical sensors create a hideous simulacrum of the world. He is more than half machine, and his survival depends entirely on the mechanical environment of the casing. His burned body was reconstructed by medical droids using techniques previously developed for Grievous. A ventilator was implanted directly into his chest, with tubes running into what remained of his lungs and throat. The apparatus itself is described as a poor fit and a form of continual torture, a kind of solitary confinement that never ends. The droids who built it used an inferior alloy, and the inner lining is continually snagging on his joints. He experiences intense claustrophobia and a desperation to be rid of the costume, needing specialized chambers where he can briefly feel human again. But those moments are always short. The instant he steps outside, the armor seals back around him. The neural needles stab into his skull, and the cycle of managed agony continues. Palpatine's own words, recorded in the 2017 Darth Vader comic series, make the integration final. The Sith Master declares to his apprentice that the cybernetic form is no mere shell or disguise. Vader has been fundamentally transformed into something his master considers little better than a droid. Grand Moff Tarkin himself reinforces this, seeing a monster fashioned in some clandestine laboratory, a being whose contained rage is very real and not the result of a cybernetic program. The compound was designed for biology. It mimics vital fluids and promotes tissue regrowth. But Vader's remaining tissue is so connected with cybernetic systems, so dependent on mechanical breathing and neural interfaces, that there is no clean boundary between the man and the machine. As described in the novel Lords of the Sith, the armored figure no longer views the casing as a prison, he sees it as his home, a shell in which he exists. It freed him from the needs of the flesh and the concerns of the body, allowing him to focus entirely on his connection to the Force. Neural needles in his helmet stab into the flesh of his skull and the base of his spine, unifying body and mind with machinery to form an interconnected unit. When Director Krennic visits Vader's sanctum on Mustafar, he hears the sound of fluid draining from a vast enclosure and the mechanical whining of 100 gleaming manipulators. As the enclosure opens, steam spills from the door, and Krennic encounters the desperate, hungry breathing of a creature clawing its way back into its skeletal horror of a shell. The medicinal fluid can soothe the tissue inside that frame. It cannot separate the man from the machine. But the Armored Enforcer was not the first being in this galaxy to discover that the compound has a breaking point. Before him, a cyborg commander and a decorated Imperial war hero both proved that even the Empire's finest medical miracles have a hard ceiling. In that same storyline, Grievous was suspended in a medicinal tank after his near-fatal shuttle crash. But even while floating in the fluid, the cyborg was keenly aware that no restorative substance could repair his body. Most of his internal organs were damaged beyond repair by the finest surgeons, requiring a duranium and a ceramic shell rather than biological restoration. He was more machine than alive, a state that would later mirror the apprentice's own condition almost exactly. He eventually ordered his healers to fish him from the tank because he could not bear to die in liquid, preferring the shadow of felled trees. This hatred of the tank mirrors Vader's own later claustrophobia and desperation to be free of his life support systems. The same narrative notes the Zychar species, who believed an injured being must go into self-exile so others would not have to see their imperfections. Years later, the young man who once claimed to wear his mechanical hand proudly would become the ultimate example of a being reshaped by machinery beyond all recognition, proving that once you cross the line from injured person to cyborg hybrid, the compound stops being a cure and becomes maintenance fluid. That same reference guide provides a second parallel through Hearst Ramodi, a decorated Imperial war hero blinded and mangled by a fragmentation grenade. Like the armored apprentice, Ramodi had access to the finest medical care that the Empire could provide. He even directed his campaigns from inside a medicinal tank. But the sources states plainly that neither flash therapy nor nanosurgery could help him. All available medical miracles had been used up, simply saving his life. Despite having the best Imperial treatment, the officer remained scarred and only fitfully lucid. This is the medical reality of the Star Wars universe. Biological recovery has a hard ceiling, and when the trauma is severe enough, every available miracle gets spent just keeping you alive. There is nothing left over for true restoration. For the armored figure, whose centuries go far beyond even what Ramodi endured, that ceiling was reached on the operating table years ago. Even so, you might expect to be strong enough in the Force to find another path to recovery. For the apprentice, the opposite turned out to be true. because the force he serves does not want him restored. Those who follow the dark side draw their strength from pain, rage, and self-hate. For the man inside the armor, his ruined body is not just a consequence of his defeat, it is the engine of his power. The armored apprentice explicitly welcomes his perpetual pain. Unlike his time as a Jedi, when he meditated for peace, he now meditates inside his pressurized chamber to sharpen the edges of his anger. He is constantly aware of the stumps of his legs, the ruin of his arms, and the sea of scars his face has become. But rather than seeking relief, he believes his broken body has perfected his spirit, and that suffering has birthed insight. Inside the chamber, he can look at his own reflection and confront the physical ruin staring back at him, using the sight to fuel a controlled, focused anger. This fury is when he feels most connected to the Force, and any reduction in his pain would weaken that connection. His master encouraged this from the start, framing the apprentice's suffering as a gift that he must choose to use to survive. To forge his red lightsaber, the Dark Lord had to pour his pain and agony into a kyber crystal until it bled crimson. Jedi librarian Jocasta Nu, upon sensing the armored figure's presence, observed that the dark side burned off him like molten metal, dripping onto her very soul. If Vader were fully restored and his pain removed, he would lose the very fuel that sustains his connection to that power. The Sith Master tells his apprentice that dark side power resides not in the flesh, but in the will, and that his physical shell is a vacuum that will eventually be filled by that power. The same novelization describes Vader's internal state as a fiery heart where he burns in his own flame. His master teaches him to take his horror in his hands and look at it, using his guilt and shame as the first key to the dark side path. He even sent his apprentice back to Mustafar, the site of his greatest defeat, so that he might rise strong and unbroken by embracing his trauma rather than recovering from it. But the master also warns that these emotions come with a price. If one falls too deep, the relationship turns, and the servant becomes a tool of those emotions rather than the wielder. Vader cannot be mended by medicine, cannot be separated from his machinery, and does not want to lose his pain. And yet, despite all of this, he still steps into the tank on a regular basis. The first function of the fluid is preservation. Because Vader's flesh is destroyed by fire and covered in synth skin, he requires periodic cleansing to be scrubbed of necrotic flesh. Without this process, the dead tissue on his wounded body would continue to decay and cause his remaining biological systems to fail. The scar tissue under his plating is in a constant state of irritation from the cybernetic limbs and the inferior alloy lining the casing. Immersion in medicinal fluid does not regrow what was lost. It prevents what remains from breaking down completely. Without constant upkeep, the hollow, metallic rasp of his breathing and his reliance on a secondary respirator would eventually fail, leading to his final death. For the armored figure, the substance is not a medicine. It is a preservation fluid for a body that should have died over 20 years ago. The second function is reprieve. The apprentice experiences intense claustrophobia and a desperation to be rid of that costume, needing a chamber where he can briefly feel human again. Inside these pressurized environments, he can remove his mask and breathe without the respirator for limited periods of time. He can take food through his mouth, he can look at his own reflection, and confront the sea of scars his face has become. Even inside his pressurized meditation chamber, however, a secondary respirator remains always attached to him, masking the ruins of his mouth. The reprieve is real, but it is never complete. One novel describes his custom-built 3-meter wide black sphere, noting he uses it to free himself from the shackles of his shell, if only for a short time, and that he appears as dependent on this chamber as he is on his respirator and helmet. The third function is engineering. His master gave the apprentice permission to adjust the apparatus as he saw fit. As a skilled engineer, Vader spends his private hours testing its limits and refining the mechanical functions. He adjusts the servo drivers and pistons in his arms to give his hands the strength to crush the hilt of his new lightsaber, compensating for the loss of his natural grace with brute mechanical power. He was given permission to supervise his own recovery and oversee changes to the frame that had become his permanent body. The fluid does not make him better. The chamber does not restore him, but together they keep the decaying flesh from rotting, giving him minutes of freedom from the armor and let him refine the machine that has replaced his body. Every session in the tank is a reminder that the man he was is gone, and that the creature he's become requires constant, deliberate effort just to keep functioning. And perhaps that is the deepest truth about the Dark Lord's relationship with the compound. It is not simply that it cannot fix him, it is that fixing him would mean undoing him. To restore the lungs, the limbs, the flesh, and the face beneath the mask would be to bring back the man who once answered to a different name. And that is a man Vader has spent over 20 years burying. The compound cannot restore Darth Vader because restoring him would mean resurrecting Anakin Skywalker. And as long as the Empire's Enforcer draws breath through that respirator, Anakin Skywalker is the one thing he can never allow himself to become. Vader would carry this broken, burning existence for over 2 decades, choosing the shell over every chance at something different. That iconic costume went through nearly 50 years of design changes, engineering revisions, and physical rebuilds before it became what audiences see on screen today. A story we trace from concept art to the final frame on the making of the character. And if you want to know what happened when his master offered a replacement and why Vader turned it down, that story reveals even more about his twisted bond with the machine he calls home.